All right, the recording is going. Hopefully you see my screen sharing just fine. So we've got just a couple more weeks of class left. So here we are on April 20th. We're going to finish up with chapter 15, maybe start with chapter 16 today already. We're a little bit ahead. So with that, we might start on that today, or we might end because there's an activity at the beginning of chapter 16. So we might just do that first thing next time. So with that, we've got chapters 15, 16, and then 17. With the time that we have left, we probably will be able to finish all those chapters well. Sometimes I have to kind of rush through chapter 17, but with the time we have, I think we'll be able to get through all of them well. And then we should have enough time to have at least half an hour or so on the 29th for going over the study guide. So as a reminder, in your Canvas, the study guide is here in Unit 4. So if you click on that, you can download the study guide. This one is more focused on specific multiple choice questions rather than general things from the chapter. So it's just got examples of questions that you'll find on the exam. And these questions are all from Unit 4. So the study guide, or the exam 4, is semi-cumulative. There's about 100 or 120 questions. I can't remember offhand. So a little longer than other exams, but about 60 to 70% of it is from Unit 4. So Unit 4 is chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So the majority of the exam is on our most recent chapters, and then about 30 or 40% of the questions come from Units 1, 2, and 3. So prep for the upcoming exam using that study guide. You can also use the previous study guides, or even go to your previous tests to prep for the material that we've already covered from Units 1, 2, and 3. We'll do a little bit of review probably at the end of chapter 15, beginning of chapter 16 as well. So you'll hopefully have some ideas of things that will be coming up on the exam. Other things to remind you of are that your final question paper, so your second question paper essentially, is due on April 30th. Also, your signature assignment and reflection paper is due that same day. So again, the signature assignment is an assignment from the class that you feel demonstrates your work well. It's probably a question paper, unless you did the extra credit for early adulthood and felt like that paper you wrote on there was really useful. So the signature assignment is an assignment you've already done that you feel demonstrates your work. The reflection paper is that about one-page reflection on the class, what you learned, what you're taking away. So you'll also turn in on that day your link to your ePortfolio. So any questions with the signature assignment reflection paper, anything like that? If you're still confused on these, we talked about it a couple weeks ago, so hopefully you've watched that lecture if you weren't here. But you can also go to this, and this has a video. I made it a couple semesters ago, so I think I talk about due dates in it, but the content in there is relevant to describe what the signature assignment is, what the ePortfolio is, how to go about getting started on that. All right, the last thing syllabus-wise to point out is that we do have one more option for extra credit. So this is a question paper, so you can write. So this is your second question paper is due this day. You can write a third additional question paper for extra credit. And so that is also due April 30th. So if you want to do that, I believe, I have to check my notes. Again, I didn't have time in between my last class and this class to double check, but I believe it's the same point value as a normal question paper. But I will definitely let you know for sure after I check that after class today. So quite a few points if you want to do another question paper that you can get for some extra credit. Don't forget, be tracking your points. The gradebook does a pretty good job of this too, so that's usually pretty accurate, but if there's ever any mistakes or problems, hopefully you've been tracking your points too. All right, so any questions about the class logistics before we get into today's lecture? All right, well, let's jump back into chapter 15. Yeah, 15. So I kind of sped through a couple of these points at the end of class last time. I want to go through, as I was watching over the video, I felt like it was a little confusing. I didn't hit all the points I wanted to. So let's start here. Some of this will be repetition, but then we can continue on from this point. So in late adulthood here, we're still talking about physical development. This is the last couple topics on physical development. So visual decline. Cataracts become a lot more common. So that's a thickening of the eye's lens. So your lens in your eye is flexible. It stretches and compresses. My kids were actually watching a Magic School Bus about it just yesterday. Maybe we should find the clip from that, from the new Magic School Bus. With this, the eye's lens becoming thick will make your vision not as good. It's going to be more cloudy, opaque, and distorted. You can have replacements, so artificial replacements for cataracts, so replacing the lens entirely. And so your vision can be clearer. But with that, the replacement lenses that's put into your eyes is not flexible in the same way. It's not attached to your muscles anymore. And so you have to use like bifocal, trifocal glasses. I don't think they have trifocal contacts. I think they have bifocal contacts, but I'm not sure. But I know they do for glasses so that you can focus at things at different ranges. So that's an operation my grandfather actually got just a couple months ago, actually. Glaucoma is another physical disease of the eye, and this is damage to the optic nerve because of pressure created by fluid buildup in the eye. So if the optic nerve is not functioning right, if it's not able to send messages as well, this can cause a lot of different problems. So macular degeneration, this image basically gives you a sense of what macular degeneration will look like. So deterioration of the center of your visual field. You've got a lot of mostly cones, if I'm not mistaken, because I believe it's the rods that do night vision and black and white, and the cones that do color vision. So you've got a lot of cones at the fovea, basically the center point of your vision. So the very center point of your vision is the sharpest. And then outside of that, you still have sensory neurons, the rods and cones, to pick up information. But usually when you're looking at something, you're using the fovea. As you're tracking words across a page, you're putting that into that highly dense area of neurons. Or when you're looking around a room, so looking over there at my bookshelf or a lamp or the computer screen, that center part deteriorates, and so you end up having a spot in the middle of your vision, essentially, where you can't see well, or it could be even very black like this. And then this vision around here is not as crisp and clear as your vision here, because that's the nerves that are the primary ones for seeing in your fovea are the ones that are deteriorating. So I breezed through circulatory system and lungs last time. Exercise can really help with your circulatory system and your lungs. There is an increase of cardiovascular disorders in late adulthood, high blood pressure, with that higher risk in men. So high blood pressure is linked to a lot of bad things. So a lot of different illnesses are correlated with high blood pressure. Obesity, anxiety, stiffening of blood vessels can have a lot of impacts. So it can have impacts of getting the proper nutrients to your muscles and bones and things all around your body, but also to your neurons. So your neurons are still getting nutrients, oxygen, whatever they need. A lot of that's coming from the blood. And so if the blood vessels are stiff, if they're deteriorating and shrinking, which is often happening in late adulthood, that means your brain might not be getting all the nutrients it needs, which we'll see as we talk about neurology and cognitive development today, can lead to deteriorating cognitive faculties. So lack of exercise is definitely a causal factor in these cardiovascular problems. So doing cardiovascular exercise, having that be a pattern from early on into late adulthood is definitely the best. But I mean, really at any time, starting exercising at any time is better than waiting, essentially. So with that, lung capacity on average, so again, we're talking normal distribution here. Some people lose more lung capacity, some people use less lung capacity, but on average, it drops about 40% between the ages of 20 and 80. So between early adulthood and late adulthood. So that's a pretty significant drop, and that's worse if someone has, say, been smoking, things like that. So sleep. So lots more difficulty sleeping as we age. So insomnia, other sleep disorders like sleep apnea. And so poor sleep is linked to a lot of mental health and physical health problems. Your body definitely needs sleep to be able to function well. I'm feeling that today. I had the second dose of the COVID vaccine yesterday, and I did not sleep well. My body is so sore today. It's awful, but better than the alternative as well. So with that, just one day of not sleeping well, my brain is a lot more fuzzy than it would generally be. With this, for late adults, this is linked to a lot of decrease in cognitive function. So as we go into talk about neurology and cognition and how cognition on average will decline at about 80 or 85, some of these are some of the reasons. So blood vessels constricting, getting stiffer, leading to less nutrients getting to the neurons. Sleep problems is also leading to less functioning of the neurons. So a lot of the physical aspects that we can do a little bit about, like proper diet and exercise, do have an impact on those cognitive functions. So sleeping too much as well, I think I did mention this, predicts earlier death. So there's a sweet spot there. So you need to be sleeping, but not too much. All right, so here, in between, we've talked about like physical development or physical capacities dropping off at certain times, and how a lot of cognitive capacities, when we look at longitudinal studies, stay pretty consistent until pretty late in life. So the point of about 65 and 75 and then 85 are three kind of critical periods or critical ages where we see kind of a definite change in different physical or cognitive faculties. So from 65 to 75, there's a loss of visual acuity. And so using corrective lenses is probably more necessary. You're not getting as much light through the retina. So with that, your color vision is decreasing a little bit. Things are a little blurrier. But at 75 and on, there's a much more significant loss of visual acuity. So color discrimination, the visual field, so your peripheral vision might be out here, might narrow into here, higher risk of these things that we just talked about, cataracts, glaucoma, macular degeneration. So that's kind of a key point. We might start to see these things happening around 65 with physical development, but at 75, it's a very clear drop if you look at longitudinal studies. Versus cognitive faculties pretty much still stay consistent up to about 85. And then there's a more steep drop off at that point. So 65, you'll start to see a drop. 75, you'll see a bigger drop if you look at a longitudinal graph for physical capacities. But it's not till about 85 for cognitive capacities. So hearing, at about 65, you're losing a lot of high frequencies, some middle frequencies. If you are 21 or older, you've probably already lost some of the high frequencies. So there are little tests. If you want, like put some earphones on, go to YouTube, go to I don't know what you'd even search for. Maybe I should find a link to it, because I always use it as an example. But adolescents, so if you're under 18, you're very likely to be able to hear the highest ranges that humans can hear. But after 18, the likelihood that you can hear those highest ranges drops down a lot. So it's kind of like a dog whistle. So if you're under 18, you can probably hear those high notes or high whistles or high sounds, versus if you're 20 or 21 or 22 or 30, very low likelihood that you can hear those high sounds. So go and find one of those, test it out, see if you're still able to hear that or not. But by 65, you've lost, probably on average have lost a lot of those high frequencies. But then at 75, there's a lot of middle frequencies lost. So that's closer to like the frequencies of human speech, and a hearing aid is going to be a lot more likely to be needed at 75 or older. So chronic conditions in middle and late adulthood. You can see the blue here is from 45 to 64. So middle adulthood, 65 plus, late adulthood. So all of these are essentially just increasing, some of them more than others. So arthritis, hypertension, hearing impairments, heart conditions, those are all a lot more likely after you hit that 65 point. Some of these like orthopedic problems in the back and extremities are still more likely after 65, but not as dramatic as, say, arthritis. All right, with this, the prevalence of chronic conditions also goes up over time. So we see early adulthood here, and this covers some of early, some of middle adulthood, middle to then late adulthood here. So blue is one or more chronic conditions, red is, or pink, I think that's more like a salmon pink. Hopefully you can see it. So you can see one or more chronic conditions increasing, the prevalence of those, and then two or more chronic conditions increasing too. So when we talk about that, that might be chronic sinus problems as well as hearing impairments are two chronic problems. More likely or more common are going to be things like heart conditions, hypertension, arthritis. Those are some very common ones in later adulthood. All right, so the probability of having diseases increases with age. Chronic diseases are kind of just those ones that stick around a lot. In late adulthood, there is a lot of research on maintaining physical capacities in response to chronic illnesses. But overall, there's not as much research in chronic illness as there is in, say, emergency medicine or things like that. So cancer is an exception. Cancer is a chronic illness that has a lot of research in it. But other things like, say, multiple sclerosis or fibromyalgia are other chronic conditions that don't have very much research done to them. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon because doctors, they get to kind of choose where they're going to practice, right? What they want to focus on. Same with researchers, medical researchers who are probably also doctors. And so it's an interesting phenomenon where chronic conditions are some of the most debilitating over time, but some of the least researched. So it's more interesting to a lot of doctors and researchers to study the more like emergency medicine, like this big crazy thing is happening, we need to fix it right now, those kind of treatments versus, hey, someone has this chronic condition, they're going to be living with it their whole life, how do we help them thrive? That's a lot less likely, which is sad, but I mean, there are people doing that research, but it's an interesting thing looking at the field of medical research. All right, so with this, a lot of older adults are dying of cancer and cardiovascular diseases. Those are two of the most common causes. So cardiovascular diseases can be prevented a little bit by proper diet, exercise, things like that. That's also relevant for cognitive factors. Ethnicity is also linked with death rates of older adults, and for that, hopefully you remember we've talked about sometimes it's really hard to distinguish ethnicity versus socioeconomic status variables, and this is one of those cases too. So socioeconomic status is linked with earlier versus later death rates. If you have the money to get medical care and proper nutrition, proper housing, you're probably going to live a little longer than someone who doesn't. All right, so arthritis, osteoporosis. Hopefully you read these definitions in your book. I think we mentioned this, maybe we didn't in this class. Falls are a leading cause of injury and also death for adults 65 plus. You might have heard the trope of someone who's pretty old, maybe 65 or older, falling and breaking their hip. Actually, what commonly happens because of the loss of bone structure, oftentimes people's hips break just spontaneously because there's too much pressure on them, they twist a little too fast, they put too much pressure on it as they're coming down the stairs, and their hip breaks, and then they fall because their hip is broken. They don't have that structural support of their skeleton to hold them up. So interestingly, doing research on that, most people who have a fall and have a broken hip, usually it's because their hip broke and it caused them to fall, which is really interesting. Which just goes to show, again, proper health and nutrition and exercise can help prevent that, keep the bones more healthy for a longer period of time. So exercise, really important. We've talked about it in the recommended times at basically every age point. So late adulthood, still should be eating well, still should be exercising. Some of the biggest things that it's impacting is your cardiovascular system. So it's keeping your lungs, keeping your heart, keeping your veins, all working more optimally. That'll reduce the risk of a lot of these problems we just mentioned. Another big thing is exercise can reduce the effects of stress. Exercise is one of the best things to do for reducing things like anxiety and stress. In studies, looking at studies of anxiety specifically, so like clinical anxiety, medicines, therapy, exercise, some studies show that exercise alone has a bigger effect size on reducing anxiety than medicine or therapy alone. Putting all three together is obviously the best. So having appropriate medicine, having appropriate therapy, as well as doing exercise, it's just three things together that help reduce anxiety. So, but interestingly, and doing exercise, especially like heavily cardiovascular exercises that get your heart pumping, get your lungs working, are very, very helpful for reducing anxiety, as well as depression. It's really interesting. Same kind of finding there. Anxiety and depression are often very linked. I know it's a little bit of a tangent, but like across the lifespan, a really effective treatment for depression is exercise. And that's a hard thing, especially for depression specifically, because one of the common symptoms of depression is not having motivation to do anything. So you just don't want to get up and move and exercise, or even take a shower, depending on the symptoms and the severity of them. So, but interestingly, exercise, medicine, therapy for depression, depending on the depending on the type of depression, one or the other is a little better or a little worse for different kinds of depression. But putting them all together, the therapy, the medicine, exercise, is a really good treatment. All right, so adequate nutrition, as we'll talk about, especially for cognitive faculties, things like omega-3 fatty acids are very important in late adulthood to help with brain function, especially having healthy fats. That helps with the myelin sheath and brain processing speed, and we'll probably talk about that again in a little bit. With that, talking to a doctor specifically about if you should be taking specific supplements or vitamins is very important. I don't think we talked about this as a class last time. I think we didn't quite make it to this. This is a really important thing, especially for people in nursing homes. So this is the last aspect of physical health in late adulthood, but it's also related to cognitive health, so it's a good transition to that. So one of the biggest factors related to the health and survival of late adults is their own perceived self-efficacy and self-determination. If they feel like they are dependent on other people for more things, they will tend to have a less happy, less thriving life. If they feel like they have more choices, more things they can do, that they can be more independent, they will tend to have a longer life. So the 15% of residents who had more choices, so in a nursing home setting, the 15% of residents who felt they had more choices and felt more control over their lives and like their day-to-day tasks, whether they wanted to do activity A or B or C or whatever it is, they were more likely to be alive 18 months later in this longitudinal study, versus the 30% who felt that they had less control or were more dependent on staff, they were more likely to be dead. So with that, if a person feels that they are more dependent, they have a much higher likelihood of dying sooner than someone who feels like they are more independent. So this can be a challenge in especially a nursing home kind of setting. I think we have a couple students in this class who have even, whether they're working there now or before, they've worked in a nursing home kind of setting. This can be hard for nursing home staff because, well, they're trying to care for the patients. So the patient might be slower at, say, getting dressed or getting out of the room to get to lunch or something like that. So the patient might be in a wheelchair or have a walker. And so in some cases, it might just be easier for the staff to do a task for the patient. But what this research shows is that we really need to try and focus, whether it's a family member like living in your home and you're caring for them there, or it's someone in a nursing home, letting people be as independent as possible is very beneficial for their well-being, them thriving in late life, and living longer. So even if someone is disabled or, for example, wheelchair bound, if someone's bound to a wheelchair, there's probably a lot of things they can still do. There might be cognitive skills or tasks that they can do and choose and have agency and independence on. So staff or family members focusing on what a person can do and helping them do those things or scaffold them when it's harder for them, that's very important for extending a person's life. This is kind of opposite of, or maybe not opposite, this is really similar to when we see children becoming more independent. We talked many weeks ago about trying to let children do tasks that they're capable of. So giving them more independence over time until in adolescence they can do a lot of things by themselves. So an example of this is my 4-year-old versus 8-year-old. The 4-year-old the other day wanted to cut their own strawberries for their breakfast. They wanted to use a sharp knife to do that. So I helped them. I sat there, I helped them hold the knife in their hand and cut the strawberries. So they were capable of that with a lot of direct support, versus my 8-year-old was capable of doing that when I'm just like standing nearby watching. If I let them practice a little more, I might even feel comfortable with them doing it by themselves. So they are gaining that independence and developing these skills. So it's kind of the same at the end of life. See what skills, what abilities a patient or a person has in late adulthood and let them make those choices. If they have the capacity to choose which activity they're going to do or what their schedule will be for a day or which food to eat or have them make their own food or clean their own dishes or things like that. Let them do those things that they can be independent on. Because if they have that perceived control, it's building self-efficacy, building self-esteem, versus if they have everything just done for them, it's very high likelihood that they will have low self-efficacy, low self-esteem, and a shorter life. So in an interesting parallel from childhood to the end of life there, that we still need to be scaffolding at the end of life. We still need to be letting people do as much as they can and then scaffold them on things that they need support of. So yeah, questions about that at all or examples that you might have? All right, well, let's continue on. Let's talk specifically about cognitive function. And we've touched on a lot of these things already. So let's just jump straight into it. That's kind of a summary slide. So one of the cognitive abilities we talked about very early on in the class, and we kind of touched on each of these at different times, but attention. Attention is one of the most important cognitive faculties that we have, the ability to attend to things, to discriminate from other things. So older adults, so in late adulthood, so as we get closer to 75 and beyond, older adults are less able to ignore distracting information. So it can be a challenge. With that, yoga, meditation, some kind of specific practice to help them focus has been shown, I mean, really at the entire lifespan, this has been shown to be helpful, but especially for late adults, doing things like yoga or meditation, having something to focus on and work and practicing on not being distracted can really help keep this attention high. So when we talk about these physical changes in the ages 65, 75, and there's a lot of drop off at those points for physical development, it's not till about 85 that we see drop-offs of attention and other cognitive faculties. interesting thing, though, that we've talked about in our middle adulthood and looking at longitudinal studies, a lot of these cognitive capacities can be maintained and can even increase in late adulthood. So while we might have perfect nutrition, perfect exercise, our physical health will probably still be declining at 65 or 75, but our cognitive health doesn't have to. It can still stay high. It can still increase in different areas. So I think it's a really positive way to look at late adulthood in those abilities that you can have cognitively, aside from things like dementia or Alzheimer's. So degenerative diseases will make that not as easy or not as effective. But for most people, for a lot of people, they can still work and have really high cognitive faculties. This goes into ageism as well. A lot of times when we see someone is older, is in late adulthood, we might assume that their memory is not going to be as good, or they're not going to be as sharp, or be able to be as creative, or things like that. And so that a lot of that's coming from ageism, when in reality, a lot of older adults have still very high cognitive functions. They may not have lost a lot of their capacities, or they might have lost specific capacities, but they're still capable of a lot. All right, so back to attention. Let's talk about some specific attentions. One is selective attention. This is what I've been having a problem with today, focusing on just one aspect of the lecture. I keep going on to relevant tangents, connecting to previous information. But selective attention would be like focusing on one conversation in the midst of a room when lots of conversations are happening. So if you're at a party, you can focus on your friend's conversation with you, or maybe you're actually focusing on a conversation over here. That's selective attention. Versus sustained attention is attention over a long period of time. So are you paying attention to the entirety of class? That would be sustained attention. Memory is another cognitive capacity that we've talked about in previous chapters. So explicit memory is those facts and experiences that we know or can state and recall. So memory does decline as a person ages. Specific pieces of memory are more likely to decline than others though. So episodic memory, this is essentially memory of episodes of your life. So where were you, what were you doing when something was happening? Your wedding day, when you graduated high school or graduated college, those kinds of things might be episodic memories. No, it's actually a flashbulb memory. That's not a good example. Semantic memory is your knowledge about the world, about things that you've read or learned, or who the president is, things like that are closer to semantic memory. So these things can decline as a person ages. With that being said, we have talked in previous chapters about ways to improve things like episodic memory. So we talked about how in middle adulthood, episodic memories are not as common, or we don't often have as many, mostly because of the stability in life. We're not doing a lot of new things, so we might not be making new episodic memories. So what can an older adult do, someone in late adulthood, let's say they're 80 or 85, what can they do to work on their episodic memory? Feel free to either take over the microphone and raise your hand, or use the chat box. So what can someone in late adulthood, 80, 85, do to improve or work on their episodic memory? Yeah, the question again is, what can a person in late adulthood, so say 80 or 85, what can they do to work on their episodic memory to make sure it's maintained, or maybe make it better? So what is a way that we can have new or better, or overall better functioning episodic memories?
I was typing, but I'll just talk instead.
Yeah,
Um,
go for
I,
it.
I think something that helps with older people is just talking with them or having conversations or asking them, like, do they know where they are or like what year it is, just making sure they're kind of like oriented to the situation type of thing, or just helping them like recall certain events in their life that they like to talk about, and they can be like, yeah, I remember this and this, and they can tell you a little bit about it.
Yeah, very good. So essentially using episodic memory, like recalling previous memories that they like to talk about, is one of the best ways to use it and to keep it as well. Another comment here, keeping a journal is a really good one. Similar to keeping journals is also taking photos and then talking about photos or recalling those memories by going through your journal or photos. So with that, while memory might decline, for an individual who's making new episodic memories, who's doing new things. Let's say, for example, your day-to-day schedule, your week-to-week schedule is really, really similar. You're doing the same things every day of the week. You're not going to be creating many new episodic memories. But if you do something different, if you and your friends in late adulthood say go on a cruise, you will probably be making new episodic memories. If you go to a concert together or something like that, you can do it on your own too. That will probably create a new and different episodic memory because it's something new and different. And so, with that, if you're using those capacities, those neural capacities, uh, that episodic memory will stay high and even increase if that's what you're specifically working on. So, really good. So, using episodic memory, creating new ones, keeping a journal, taking photos, recalling those memories, trying to make new ones is some of the best ways to keep memory up. And so we might assume generally that people might lose a lot of memory capacity, but they don't have to, is one of my main points to get across, is that after 85, it is more likely that someone will have memory deficits, that their capacity for doing episodic memory will decline. A lot of that's also dependent on the context that they're in. If they're still really active, they're still doing new and different things, trying new and different things, that episodic memory will not decline. All right, implicit memory is that memory that is not a conscious recollection of something. It's basically how to do procedures. So, how do I pick up and use a spoon as a simple one? Or how do I drive a car? So, where do I put my hands? Where's the gas pedal? Those kinds of things. Those kinds of procedures. How to use cooking utensils to make my favorite dish or something like that. Those are a lot of that comes down to implicit memory, just the procedures that you go around doing things. This is less likely to be affected um, throughout aging. So, generally, unless there's something like Alzheimer's or dementia, generally implicit memories are not lost. Physical capacity, like let's say driving a car, if your vision's bad, you might still know where to put your hands and how to actually drive the car. But if you can't see very well, you probably shouldn't be driving the car. Um, but the knowledge of how to do it, that implicit memory of how to go through those procedures, probably doesn't decline for most people. So working memory and perceptual speed. Hopefully when I say working memory, it brings up to your mind the examples that we've talked about, like a table where you're bringing in long-term memories, the sensations and perceptions you're experiencing now. One example I've used a lot is the Inside Out movie and those emotions, like that table, and they're seeing things and they're calling up long-term memories. That's essentially what working memory is doing. It's essentially your conscious experience. Right now, your working memory is going. It's hearing the things I'm saying, maybe pulling in previous information. Maybe you're getting distracted or having to not be distracted by something in your environment. So that's happening in your working memory. That and perceptual speed, so how quickly we can do those things like pull up a long-term memory or respond to a new sensation or perception. Those tend to slow down, especially after about 85. Again, you can do specific trainings to work on working memory, to work on perceptual speed. Diet helps a lot with these. So the speed is affected a lot by, say, the myelin in the brain and having proper nutrients so that neurotransmitters are there that should be. We'll talk about some deficits in neurotransmitters later. Uh, but working memory, perceptual speed tends to, on average, start to decline at 80 or 85, but they are one thing that can be maintained. So there's actually a lot of apps now that you can use to practice working memory tasks. It will like quiz you and be like, hey, remember these 3 or 4 random words or something like that. So there's a lot of different tools that you can do and use to work on your working memory. This might be useful for you yourself as you get older, or if there's a member of your family or people in your professional life that are getting older and have mentioned things with their memory, you can have them work on that. My mother has multiple sclerosis, so while it's not because of age yet that her memory has problems, her working memory does have problems because of myelin and basically signals getting crossed, you could say, neurologically. So doing specific training things that her neurologist has given her has allowed her to keep a lot of the capacity that she might have otherwise lost with that degenerative disease. So same kind of thing for late adulthood. All right, so executive functioning, these are a lot of tasks that are done in the prefrontal cortex. So regulating emotions, paying attention, like switching attention, goal setting, a lot of working memory tasks is executive functioning tasks. And these do tend to decline once we get to about 85 and beyond. The nice thing, though, is these don't tend to decline before then. So things like updating memories in your brain, it's going to be a little slower for people on average. But again, this is something that you could work on. You can work and get specific apps or training tools to work on executive functioning. So decision making specifically is one aspect of executive functioning that doesn't seem to be affected by aging as much. So the ability to basically judge and make decisions stays pretty constant throughout life. Versus the processing speed, goal setting, monitoring your goal progress, that will tend to slow down. So other things you can do, this game actually right here, these people are playing bridge. Any cognitively intensive game that requires you to plan ahead, to think creatively, to strategize, that's using your cognitive faculties are going to help with a lot of these aspects of cognitive functioning. So being active and doing things that engage your mind is really important in late adulthood, as well as for executive functioning. All right, so wisdom used to be researched in the realm of cognition. So it was thought that it was really highly correlated with some of these cognitive faculties. If you had better cognitive performance, more likely that you could solve problems and be wise. So the definition of wisdom that we're using here is expert knowledge about practical aspects of life. So things like how to manage relationships or bounce back after a breakup. So like those practical things, how to deal with solving problems around the house or with cars or just general day-to-day life things. So, and having excellent judgment about important life matters. So it used to be thought that wisdom was really highly correlated with cognitive capacity. So cognitive speed, processing, things like that. Interestingly though, one, high levels of wisdom are rare. So if you take 10 people, you're not likely to have more than like 2 or 3 of them having high wisdom. And interesting, late adolescence and early adulthood, and I think we talked about this when we were talking about early adulthood, is the primary ages to see wisdom developing. So what researchers have found is that wisdom is not so much down to cognitive capacity, but it's down more to life experiences. So if someone has had a wide variety of life experiences, seen a lot of different ways that people live life, or they've tried to live life in different ways, that they've solved lots of problems and observed other people solving problems, had different relationships, different challenges, it's more likely that that person will develop wisdom, will be able to see and be able to put together things in different creative ways to solve practical problems. If someone's pattern of life ever from early adulthood to late adulthood was really, really similar at every point, didn't really have very many different life experiences, that person is a lot less likely to develop wisdom. So we generally start to see wisdom in late adolescence and early adulthood. You can develop it later on in life, but just on average, that's when we start to see it. And then those people can still continue to build wisdom, just like someone could start to develop wisdom in late adulthood. It's just more likely that you're going to be having a wider variety of life experiences earlier on in life. So late adolescence, early adulthood, those times of transition and change. So it's kind of an interesting thing. We tend to think of wisdom as something in late adulthood, but it really starts in early adulthood, late adolescence. And then generally for those people who have developed wisdom, they continue to build it. They continue to be, let's say, open to new life experiences, things like that. So they have more knowledge of practical aspects and can make good judgments and share that with other people. Versus someone who didn't have very many experiences throughout life, probably less likely that they'll be wise. So, yeah, basically those other 2 bullet points summarize what I just said. So thinking about late adulthood and education, many generations basically generations in America are more educated than previous generations, so higher rates of having college degrees, things like that. Also, generations have been placing more and more emphasis on cognitively oriented labor, so work that uses your brain versus manual labor using, say, muscles. So with that, if someone is involved, if a late adult is involved in cognitively oriented labor, it is correlated to advantages after retirement. So one example that I can use for this is, let's say you're a programmer. That's rather than being physically demanding, you're probably sitting at computer screens and learning new programs, but you're not really doing anything too physically demanding. But you might have to learn a new programming language. You might have to learn how to apply this programming language or to this new problem, to this new program, to this new thing that your company is doing. So that kind of cognitively intensive work, it's more likely for that person to have cognitive advantages later on in life. So they're still being active up to retirement. And we'll talk in a second about people who don't retire. Same kind of thing. If they're being cognitively active, their memory, their executive function, it will stay more consistent or even still increase if they are using those capacities. So that's why one of these first slides said use it or lose it at late adulthood. If you're using those capacities or you're working on those capacities, you can keep them or improve them. If you're not using them, they'll probably start to decline when you're in your mid-80s. So successive generations have also been more physically healthy. So research in nutrition, exercise, things like that have helped along this way. So while we used to talk about a more dramatic terminal decline at the end of life, now most of the people who are physically aging, it's a more slow, steady process of slowly losing capacities rather than like all at once kind of thing. And it's extending later in life. Hey, this is the point I just made a little early. So use it or lose it. Do things to engage your mind. This is relevant at any point in life. If you want to develop your working memory, you can do it now, whether you're 12, 22, or 82. You can build your working memory. So with that, reading books, crossword puzzles, going to lectures, going to concerts, going on cruises, going to a national park you've never been to before, learning a new skill, learning photography. These are examples of things that you could do to work your cognitive abilities. And if a late adult is doing these things, they're going to keep and maintain and even improve a lot of their cognitive capacities. They're probably going to be having higher well-being. They'll have more self-efficacy. So hopefully some of this sounds really repetitious to aspects of thriving throughout life, because it is. So mental exercise, also lowers the risks of developing things like Alzheimer's disease or dementia. Some of them are genetically related too, so even if you do kind of postpone it, some people will just get it, but you can make the progression slower or keep it away or at bay for a longer period of time with cognitive exercises. So if you, on average, if you're not trying and not training and not doing things to improve your cognitive function, people 85 years and older, that's when we start to see the sharp decline. So for physical abilities, 65, we see a little decline. 75, we see a lot more decline. And then at 85, if you're not doing anything specific, you'll start to see those declines in cognitive capacities. I think I mentioned this. Exercise and nutrition, especially omega-3 fatty acids and things like fish oils, can be really helpful in keeping the neurological systems working well. All right, so before we get more into cognitive neuroscience, let's take a little break. Let's be back at 10:58 from this little break, and we'll continue on. I think we'll be able to finish with this chapter and then start with 16 first thing next time. So let's take a quick break. All right, and we are back. So hopefully the audio is working still. Let's continue on. All right, so cognitive neuroscience, some of the things that we've talked about here already in late adulthood are very neuroscience related. So neuroscience essentially looks at the physical structures of the brain and what that does for brain processing. So a neuroscientist is going to be one of the ones that investigates neurons, how they work, how the neurotransmitters work, to send messages, to create memories, to use attention, to sense and perceive things. That's neuroscience. So, changes in the brain can influence cognitive functioning. So, the growth or shrinking of axon branches and dendrites can increase cognitive capacities. More connections, faster connections, myelination can make cognitive functions faster, and changes in cognitive functioning can then also influence the physical structure of the brain. So if you're not using some of your cognitive capacities, those neurons are going to pull back some of those axon branches, some of those dendrites. You might not be sending as much nutrients to those neurons. So it's both ways. The cognitive functioning can influence the brain can influence cognitive functioning. Another example of this is your circulatory system. If your blood vessels are shrinking and harder, you're not going to be getting as much nutrients to your brain. That's going to impact your cognitive functioning. All right. So things like exercise, things like using your brain, being active are some of the best things to do for your brain, eating proper nutrition. So some of these same things that we've been hearing the entire time of class, still really important, and maybe even, I don't know about more important, still very important for late adulthood to keep and maintain cognitive capacities. So with this, let's talk also about work and retirement. So the labor force includes men and women over the age of 75. So for women, that's up 75% or 87% since the year 2000. For men, it's up about 45% since the year 2000. So more and more people are working past 75. So what are some of the reasons for that? Actually, let's get some guesses from students. I mean, if you're looking at the slides on your own, you can go ahead and see what the reasons are. But why do you think so many more people are working past age 75? Good. So we've got a couple comments here. There might be more coming in, so sorry if I read these before yours come in. But cost of living increases. Yeah, and then also don't get sufficient money for retirement. So both of those are around money. So not having enough money, whether it's because cost of living increases, so they might have budgeted X amount for groceries for the rest of their life, and now groceries cost more. Or just generally not having sufficient money for retirement. And yeah, that is one of the primary reasons, especially in the US, for people working longer. So the primary reason for people working past 75 is financial needs. So other reasons that they might be working past 75 is health. So this also goes along with financial. It's hard to get health insurance that's good outside of, say, a employee plan. So something that your company pays into and everybody's paying into your overall health insurance plan. So it might be for that as well. Maybe they want to work for their health. Another thing is knowledge. They like doing the work. They find purpose in the work. So, but yes, the biggest one is exactly what you said, is money. Those financial needs is the primary reason people are working beyond that time. So a couple slides later, this is very different than some other countries. So in other countries, 33% of those in their 60s and 11% of those in the 70s are still working. So that's a lot smaller than here in the US. So a lot more people are working than that 33 and 11% because of those financial needs. There's another point I was going to make there, but it just left me. Oh, yes. So we talked earlier about, in the last class period, about centurions, people who have lived to be 100. So a lot of them are not doing work for pay, but a lot of them are active in doing hobbies or working in the community. So that kind of work isn't what we're talking about here, right? Here we're talking about paid work specifically. So these people in many other countries have that opportunity that they can do work that they enjoy, that they find purpose in life, in their community, rather than having to work, say, a 9-to-5 job to get the money that they need. And this can be very challenging for people to do that work here in the US because of ageism, because it's not as likely that they're going to be hired once they get to a certain age. And we talked about last time that there's a lot of motivation for companies to lower labor costs by pushing out workers who've been there a while, where they might train a new worker and pay them a lot less to do those same tasks. So it can be a big challenge because of that ageism, as well as the idea that maybe these adults are not as cognitively capable of doing the work. But interestingly, cognitively, older adults have a lot more capacity than people generally tend to think. So with this, cognitive ability is one of the best predictors of job performance in older adults, and older workers actually have lower rates of absenteeism, fewer accidents, and higher job satisfaction than their younger counterparts. So I am interested to see what kinds of jobs they're looking at here. I would suspect that you'd have higher job satisfaction if you're doing something that's meaningful to you versus if you were doing a job that you just had to do to get the money. So let's say you're checking out at a grocery store. It's possible someone's finding purpose in that, but I suspect a lot of older adults who are doing that job are just doing that for the money because they need that. So I do wonder if these results would apply there. But they do have lower rates of absenteeism and fewer accidents. I do wonder about that job satisfaction piece. So with this, there are more adults rejecting the early retirement option, and that is worldwide. With this being said, usually it's, again, because of that financial reason. They need to have financial resources to survive. So older adults who do retire, who does better and who does worse? So those who adjust best to retirement are those who are physically healthy. So probably not too surprising. If they don't have as many physical health concerns, they'll probably do pretty well in retirement. If they have adequate income, not too surprising. If they don't have to worry about going back to work, if they have enough money for their food, for housing, for travel, or whatever they're doing, they're going to be a lot better off than if they don't have those, so if they have higher stress. If they're active, they're going to be better off. So doing hobbies, being involved in community, these kinds of things, being generative, they're going to be doing better in retirement. And then also it's correlated with higher education. So education is also correlated with being more healthy and having a higher income, but not everybody who has a higher education does have a higher income, for example. So that is definitely a correlation, not necessarily a causal variable there. So other things that help a lot for retired adults is connecting with people. So we talked about how other people are important, how other people matter when we were talking about positive psychology. So connecting with social networks, connecting with family. Now that people are retired, oftentimes they make new connections with people that they were friends with earlier on in life, but they just kind of lost contact with. It's a really common phenomenon that they have friends that maybe they only got to see once a year or even less than that, that now they're able to contact more, call on the phone, visit with, those kinds of things, but also family as well. So if they're satisfied with their lives before retiring, they'll tend to do better in retirement. And if they have more cognitive flexibility, so if they have some of those executive function cognitive capacities, they'll be better at being more flexible and making new plans, adjusting to a new life that's probably less structured, or making their own structure in retired life than when they were working and had a pattern of things that they were doing. So with this, those are some positive aspects looking at retirement. Here's some maybe less positive things. So with this, the first two are kind of positive, and then the last one is kind of negative. So in 2017, they did a survey of lots of, I believe it was nationally representative, so trying to get a big variety of people at different ages in retirement and pre-retirement, as well as a lot of different ethnicities, a lot of different socioeconomic statuses. So about 18% of people that they surveyed were very confident that they would have enough money through retirement. About 60% were confident that they would have enough money through retirement. So with this, you can imagine this is probably one question on a survey asking, how confident are you that you'll have enough money through retirement? Not very confident, or I don't know what the lower range is, to like neutral, to confident, to very confident. So very confident was probably the top, and then not at all confident was probably the bottom. So with that, about 78% are confident or very confident that they'll have enough money, but still about 30% of people felt that preparing for retirement caused them a lot of emotional distress. So a lot of people are worried about having the financial means that they need to be able to retire. It's a very stressful thing. What will they do with themselves? How will they get the money they need? What will they do if there's a health emergency? There's a lot of different things that make it a challenge to retire and adjust to retirement. So maybe there are some things you can think of that might help to support these people. All right, so let's talk about some of these. We've mentioned them, like dementia and Alzheimer's, a couple times. Let's define them and just give a couple of facts about them here at the end of this chapter. So dementia is a neurological disorder, and the primary symptoms are deteriorating mental functioning. So things like memory, decreased cognitive capacity, decreased working memory. So with this, 23% of women and 17% of men 85 and older are at risk. So with that being said, women do tend to get dementia more because they also tend to live longer. So the risk is higher as you get older. Women are living longer, so they're getting dementia more. So things like diet and exercise and cognitive training can reduce the risk as well as maintain cognitive function if you are seeing signs of dementia. So catching dementia, catching Alzheimer's early is best. Doing preventative things like having proper diet, proper exercise, doing cognitive training to keep your skills up. It will help prevent these from happening, but even if they do happen, it can slow their progression dramatically versus just succumbing to this deterioration. So Alzheimer's disease is similar in some ways. It's a gradual deterioration of memory primarily, and that's one of the main things that like family members tend to see is grandpa or grandma is not remembering people around them or remembering events from their life. That's oftentimes one of the common symptoms. But also reasoning, language, and physical function can be affected by Alzheimer's. So women, again, are more likely to develop it because they're living longer. And the main thing here is Alzheimer's is coming from a deficiency of the chemical acetylcholine in the brain. So it's one of the supports in the brain and neurotransmitters. So it can have a wide-ranging effect. So also amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. So there's other cells other than just neurons. I know that's been most of our focus in this class is the neurons in the brain, but there are cells that literally hold neurons in place and help funnel, kind of like highways to funnel nutrients to neurons. So those different things can have plaques or neurofibrillary tangles, and these kinds of changes are linked to genetics as well. So with that being said, if you have the genetic tendency to have Alzheimer's and you don't do anything at all, you don't change your diet, your exercise, your cognitive training, it's pretty high likelihood that you'll have it earlier and the prognosis will be worse. So you'll end up succumbing to it quicker. But if you're having proper nutrition, proper exercise, specific cognitive training, especially if you catch it early and see the signs and work with your neurologist on those faculties that you're losing. So if you're losing working memory, working specifically on working memory is going to be a big help. So it's really individual, the kinds of care a person will need for dementia or Alzheimer's. So early detection, doing things like fMRIs can really help. And it's hard to see this mild cognitive impairment is that transitional state between cognitive changes of normal aging and then the early stages of disease. So it can be hard for, say, family members to recognize and see that, oh, this person's symptoms are not just aging. This might be a sign of dementia, or this might be a sign of Alzheimer's or something like that. It can be really difficult. So doing more preventative medicine, getting checked, being aware of these things can be very helpful to slow the effects of these diseases. So there's a lot of different drugs for Alzheimer's. Other things to care for them is support people with Alzheimer's physically and emotionally. That can be really draining for family, especially if a person needs 24/7 care. So nursing homes are an option, but there's also respite care. So services where you can have basically a person stay at a nursing home for a few days and then come back home. Or you can have a nurse come and stay with that patient for a few hours of a day to enable you to get out and do things that you need. So respite care can be really helpful. Again, as much as possible, giving the patients, the people with either Alzheimer's, dementia, letting them have whatever kind of independence they can have is going to help. Again, catching it early, doing work to prevent it, health behaviors, diet, cognitive training is some of the best preventative things. Parkinson's disease is the last one we'll mention. So it's also a progressive disease. So muscle tremors, slowing of movement, facial paralysis are some of the features of this neurodegenerative disease. So that is the end of chapter 15. Oh, here, this one, Parkinson's is triggered by dopamine producing neurons. So again, we've got different neurons that do different things in the brain. Dopamine does a lot of different things. It's not just the happy chemical. It does a lot of management of other regulatory functions of neurons. But yeah, that is the end of chapter 15. The beginning of chapter 16, we will review some of the previous stuff that we've learned. So Erikson's theories, we'll look at Bronfenbrenner's theory, developmental cascades, and then you'll come up with your own lifespan development theories, maybe taking pieces of other things that you've learned so far and putting them together in your own way. So we'll do that when we come back on Thursday. So thanks for being here today. Have a great rest of your day. If you have any questions about question papers, signature assignments, e-portfolios, I'll stay on for a minute and you can ask those now, or you can also feel free to email me. So talk to you later.